event info. Salam everybody, welcome to the Samawar network. Sorry for the technical difficulties. We were having some trouble getting things loaded. We have a YouTube page, a YouTube channel that hopefully will show all the videos that we have, and you guys can access it through there. But thank you for everyone who is watching, wherever you may be. Please remember to be on the Facebook page, and please, write your comments, questions on the Facebook page, and we'll do our best to address them. We're still waiting on a couple other people to join us, but we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you everyone for your patience, and Ramazan Mubarak to everyone. So as we get started, let's just go ahead and begin with just introducing the panel. And just so you know, this is not the first time that we've had these conversations. We've done these discussions. This is actually the fourth one that we've had. The first one started off with a discussion about the riots the uprisings that happened in Baltimore. The use of the word riot was something that we discussed. But we talked about the Baltimore uprisings and the shooting of Freddie Gray that happened. So want to make sure everyone understands that this is an ongoing discussion that we've had. This is our fourth one. We also have spent some time talking about the role of gender and some of the issues in relation to misogyny and stereotypes and double standards that exist in our community was a previous discussion we had. And most recently we had one on the Charleston shooting that just occurred on the AME Church in South Carolina. So just want to welcome everyone again to our discussion tonight, and we'll go ahead and get started with just introducing everybody, all the panelists who are here. Their bios are on the Facebook page, but if everyone on the panel could just say your name, where you're from, and we'll go ahead and get started after that. So we'll start with Ali John. He's all the way to my left, so we'll go ahead with you first.
Salam everyone, my name is Ali. I am a historian, writer, and PhD student at the University of California and a scholar of religion.
And Arzo John?
Salam everyone, my name is I'm from Washington, D.C., and I'm a social activist here. I'm happy to be here with you all.
And Bilal?
Salam, my name is Bilal. I'm a student at American University here in DC.
Hello, John.
How's it going, guys? My name is Dawood. I live in Orange County, but I was born and raised in DC. Myself and Ali actually host a weekly talk show called Currently Nerdy that we discuss current events and things like that.
Lema?
Hi, my name is Lema. I'm originally from Fremont. I currently live in Sacramento, and I am a civil and human rights policy advocate.
Message John.
Salam everybody. My name is Masood. I'm from the Bay Area. Work with different community, the youth community in the area, Muslim communities, and coach soccer and play soccer on the side.
Nura John.
Salam, my name is Nura. I'm a PhD student at Duke University.
And Samira John. Samira, you're on mute, so you're going to have to unmute yourself first.
There we go. Can you hear me now?
You're good.
Okay, good. My name is Samira. I'm from Toronto, and I do work with advocacy and activism work with youth, Muslim and Afghan youth in refugee and immigrant communities here around criminalization and those who have to deal with the police system.
And my name is Omad. I work at UC Santa Cruz, originally from Fremont, California. I just wanted to welcome everyone again. This is our fourth time doing this, so I know there was a lot of attention and a lot of folks that were interested in this particular topic. So I want to thank everyone for joining us. So, just so you know, the Facebook page is up there for everyone to join in, to comment with their questions. And I just want to make a couple of things clear before we get started, is that, this discussion and this group We don't pretend to speak for every single person and every single opinion in the Afghan community. This is a group of individuals that came together and felt that it was necessary to have these types of discussions and have this type of dialogue. And so I just wanted to kind of make that clear, and we wanted to discuss this in a critical, serious way because I think it's something that's needed. And just so you know, if people in the audience or people on the panel, you may disagree with something that may be said, but it's important that you understand that all of us here, and I think everyone who is watching, listening, understands that we're coming at this with a deep love and for our community, and we do this work, and we want to do this, continue to do this to make our community better, and hopefully you all join in on that. In tonight's topic is going to be talking about the recent ruling from the Supreme Court of the United States of America, ruling that same-sex marriage was constitutional and now legal in all 50 states. This is something that we've obviously seen in the news, something that's come up in the media a lot, that we wanted to make sure that we had a discussion within the Afghan community to talk about what that means for us and how that impacts our community. And in particular, we're going to talk about the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender community, queer community that exists in our within the Afghan diaspora, and address some of the issues that community deals with. So we felt that this was a good time to have that discussion and to start that. So we look forward to having all of you do that. And everyone's going to come into this with different levels of understanding, different knowledge, different pieces of knowledge, and that's okay. That goes for people on the panel, for people who are watching. We don't expect everyone to be experts or to know every single thing or to be in. We're all in different places in our understanding, and we just encourage everyone to continue learning and continue gaining something from this. So first, I actually wanted to pose a question to the panel that maybe they may or may not have been prepared for, but I know for myself, this was something that I was pretty nervous about discussing, and something that was a bit difficult to do and to do in the right and the correct way. So I just wanted to ask you all, what makes this topic, or makes the issue of being lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, anyone who might be in our community, why is this topic so difficult for us to talk about? Why does this feel like something so hard for us to touch on? So whoever wants to kind of get us started with that, would love to hear what you all have to think. Someone needs to get us started. Layla, there you go.
Throughout the years, I have gone back and forth with my feelings regarding the issue, and I think what the biggest fear is how our family members who were not brought up in this society, who have pre-existing notions of being LGBTQ, are going to say that we have a different understanding of people that we know who are. And so I think we're fearful of that backlash and that fear that we are sinning in the terms that, we understand that there should be a right to human dignity. And that's not all we. I'm just talking from my perspective, that if I have a friend or family member that I respect and love, I'm going to treat him or her with dignity. And so I think other people tend to be, they don't even want to see it. They want to close their eyes that can even exist in our culture and in our religion. So that's my personal view of the situation.
Go ahead, Nora.
Yeah, I think jumping off of that, I think this is the one issue where we have a lot more in common with all communities, in the sense that you see Asian communities, African American communities, even your general sort of WASP community dealing with this issue, and for some reason there's all these weird misconceptions that exist about people that have different orientation than what is the norm. And we have our own problems with that in terms of challenges of misconceptions we have, and it's something that other communities are grappling with too. I'm glad that we're taking this moment to sort of unpack that, because I think most people who have orientations that may be different than what we think is the norm are not comfortable to speak up, and it's quite obvious because you see the sort of rhetoric from pop culture to even derogatory terms that we use are so pervasive in our language, whether it's in like Dari or English, it's there, it's real, and we have to be willing to talk about it.
Bilal?
I want to thank both Lema and Noura for what they said, because I definitely agree with it. And also, I think in Afghan culture and in larger like Muslim culture, we're told not to broadcast or publicize our struggles, right? We're told, I remember specifically having Islam teachers who said, if you are struggling with a certain issue or something, don't tell the entire community about it. That's something that's kind of antithetical to Afghan culture. We're supposed to, if there's something that we're struggling with, we're supposed to keep it quiet. And so obviously this issue of sexual orientation, sexual identity, if, like Noura said, if your sexual orientation is outside of the norm, you're not supposed to broadcast it. And so people are probably going to be asking us, why are we talking about this now? But the point that I want to underscore is that in the LGBT community, silence is death. More often than not, silence is death. Rates of suicide and depression among LGBTQ youth are the highest in any other, compared to any other group. And that's because it's not just Afghan society, it's any society. It's one of the most marginalized groups that we have because of this misunderstanding.
Arza?
So you guys made some wonderful points, and I wanted to add that you know, in America, homosexuality was first seen as a mental disorder back in the 60s, and you know, the societal response to it was that they equated it with, you know, drug addictions and alcoholism, and I think that, you know, and because they classified it as a mental disorder, you know, just in American society, it's almost taboo to talk about, you know, mental disorders, and of course with Afghans, it's become a stigma as well. It's become a taboo topic. We don't talk about mental disorders, and I think that mentality has carried on into our community, our culture as well, where people think that it's a mental disorder and therefore they don't talk about it or they don't want to address it. And so I think that it's almost under that, where Afghans see it under that same category, which is why they don't even discuss it. And same goes for, like, you know, mental health as well. We don't really discuss like the issues that we go through, whether it's depression, anxiety. We kind of just sweep it under the rug, and I think that you know, is an issue. That's probably one of the reasons why we have this fear. Where this fear is coming from. It's coming from, even to talk about it, we fear of being judged by others, and so that's my personal 2 cents.
Ali John?
To add on to that, I absolutely agree with everything the panel is saying. It's also an extraordinarily sensitive topic. It's a topic that brings about a lot of heated emotions from people, because it intersects with a lot of different delicate things in society. Questions of masculinity, questions of gender, questions of religion. How does it intersect with civil society? How does it intersect with laws and rights? And people who are non-political or even non-religious will often have extremely strong opinions about this matter specifically. So it does bring out quite a bit of emotions, quite a bit of passions on a variety of different sides, and that makes it very difficult to talk about. A single post on Facebook can quickly descend into ad hominems and angry rants. So it is a sensitive topic, and it's a topic that's clearly touching some type of nerve within the community, within society, and even as in the nation as a whole.
And I wanted to also add that you know, people are coming to this topic with different ideas, are coming to, I think, you know, Lema shared her experiences of things being taught growing up and just kind of wrestling with it, and Bilal also shared, you know, what he was taught as well. And like, I think it's one of those things where it's hard to even make an informed opinion when you can't even talk about it. And the fact that we don't even discuss it makes it really difficult for anyone to have any sort of opinion one way or the other. And we end up just getting our opinion based on what we've been fed and what's been told to us, what's been taught to us our whole lives, without ever having that space to wrestle with it and to think about it and to hear different perspectives, different ideas, whatever it may be. And for a lot of people who could potentially be allies, or who could potentially see something, it's just even talking about it automatically means like maybe you support a gay lifestyle, or maybe you support same-sex marriage just by even mentioning it. That's something that I think we need to kind of discuss, because we can never really fully develop our understanding and our ideas if we're hesitant to do that, and if we think that just by talking about it we've automatically taken some sort of position. So I think that kind of hurts us in moving on. Bilal, did you have something to add to that?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, because we are afraid to talk about it for various reasons. Like Ali said, because it brings up questions of masculinity and our culture and religion. We're afraid to talk about it, but that fear and that silence leads to complete misunderstanding about what different sexualities are, right? So people think that if you're homosexual, you're attracted to young boys, right? Not that they think they conflate it with pederasty, pedophilia. They don't think of it as homosexuality. And so this kind of silence around it leads to further misunderstanding, which is really harmful. And so I'm glad that we're talking about it today.
So I wanted to shift this into what I'm hoping the discussion will be, a lot of the discussion will be surrounding, which is around the topic of homophobia, and just kind of talking about what does that look like in our community, and how does that play out? How are folks who are LGBTQ, how are they accepted? How are they seen within our community, and how does that play into that? So I kind of threw a bunch of things, but let's just kind of start out with what homophobia is, and what and just try to have an understanding of that. So Dojan, I'll let you go ahead and get started.
I mean, from my personal experiences, like I posed a question on Facebook the other day, kind of bringing up the subject of same-sex marriage, and I kind of got a mixed bag. I got people from like one side who are allies and totally for it, but then you also see a lot of homophobia coming in, because I think a lot of people in our community are very misinformed about the LGBTQ community. Like, they don't know enough about it to make a judgment about it. They're just taught that like this is wrong because of this, this, and this, so they just assume that like every homosexual is the same way, or they assume like a lot about the homosexual community that isn't true. And we see a lot of homophobia with it, and then they compare it to like other things that like you shouldn't be comparing it to, which is just terrible. So like you see a lot of homophobia in our community, and I think that's one thing we need to stop, because we get dealt with Islamophobia being Muslims, and we can't expect other people to not judge us for our beliefs if we're judging other people based on their lifestyles.
Alijan?
Well, Dojan took slightly the point I was going to make, but he's absolutely right. That actually homophobia and Islamophobia are very closely related to one another. They're both based off an ignorance of the proverbial other. And they're both based on fear and hatred and prejudice. And the sad reality is that we have allowed homophobia to sit in our community and fester. And I'm not saying that having a diversity of opinions is a bad thing. It's actually a fantastic thing to have a diversity of opinions. Not everyone is going to agree with me. But when the opinion falls into the realm of ignorance, when it becomes prejudicial, when it starts to oppress and suppress a group of people, that is when it becomes dangerous. And we need to recognize that. And the sad reality is that we don't in our community. There's a lot of fantastic activists and people who stand up and make a lot of efforts, but our community has a lot of work to do, because the LGBT community is actually one of Islam's most powerful allies right now. They fight against Islamophobia quite harshly within this country, because they recognize that Islamophobia and homophobia are based off of the same ignorance and the same fear.
And Lema, go ahead.
Nothing. I just want to make a small comment. Today I went online and I just Googled what is the definition of homophobia. And it was very simple, and there were two different definitions that came up. One was the dislike and prejudice towards homosexuals, and the fear and hatred towards homosexuals. And so I think that that plays really strongly into Ali's points. That's how simple it is. And there was like a lot of social media comments of people who mentioned, like, I'm fearful of speaking out against homophobia because I'm going to be seen as homophobic. I mean, I just want to put that out there because that in the end, they are fearful of making themselves seem like the opposite end of someone who is Islamophobic. Just a thought to put in there.
I think that is a good question. I think something to think about is can somebody who may not agree with homosexuality, right? Or maybe just has an understanding of it, like, can they still be an ally, or can they still, how do they talk about this for someone who may have fear that, like, coming out about just talking about, like, you know, sharing their ideas or thoughts about, like, what they've been taught growing up and coming out about those things, like, do they have a space to talk about it, and how should they go about that, or what does that look like? Bilal?
I think it's an interesting question, this intersection of Islamophobia and homophobia, and whether we can be allies for each other. As someone who experiences both homophobia and Islamophobia, they've always been intertwined. You know, I can't count the instances of discrimination being more on one side or the other. I consider myself, you know, a Muslim, and I see daily instances of prejudice, of ignorance, of outright kind of violence towards Muslims in the media and also in my personal life. But also growing up, you know, I was called a faggot every day in high school, and so for me, this is a very powerful point, that we can't stand up for each other. If we don't stand up for each other, no one else will stand up for us. We are both marginalized communities, right? We are marginalized communities, and people like me are marginalized within a marginalized community. And so it's, you know, it's not a question of who's most discriminated against. It's just, how can we all help each other? And like everyone else has said in this discussion, if we can't, you know, fight for someone else's rights, why should we expect them to fight for our rights?
And Samira, John, go ahead.
To build off of that, I think, you know, the struggles that the LGBTQ community faces in North America or in the Western world, those that are people of color face much more than that, and I think that's the greater challenge in all of this, in terms of like the Afghan community, for example, is that not only are Afghans who identify as gay facing that sort of stigma and oppression that the average white male or white female gay individual is facing, but they're also, that's intertwined with language issues, with their religious issues, the racism, the xenophobia, and the Islamophobia that they face. And I think that intersection is important to address, and that is the reason why there is an immense lack of support networks available for people who are affected by all those issues. I mean, we have support networks in place for those impacted by racism or those impacted by Islamophobia, but I think it's much more difficult to find not only support, but just a community in general as someone who identifies as gay and then also as Afghan or Muslim, etc.
Noura, John, I think you were going to chime in.
Well, yeah, so in terms of, we were just discussing sort of homophobia and thinking through what that means. I think a lot of it's sort of this fear of the unknown, right? This phobia, right? if you haven't interacted with people that you know, because a lot of people haven't come out and they're not willing to discuss that you know that they may have a different orientation than you, right? And I remember, this is a personal anecdote, but I think the most powerful experiences you have are the personal ones that help you sort of illuminate what goes on in your life. And when I was in high school, I felt like I had this like moment where my identity became visible when I decided to wear the hijab, and I went to an all-white high school, right? My biggest ally was my history teacher, who was gay. And we sort of developed, and he was probably the reason that I went to college where I went and sort of all these other things. But in terms of me struggling with my identity and coming out as Muslim in an all-white high school, it was really powerful experience to have him as my supporter and for my parents to see that relationship, because he was, so for me, to see these lived experiences, and I think we need to recognize these relationships because it's these daily experiences and interactions that make this powerful, that we're in this together in terms of the struggles we face. And you wouldn't expect that, you know, you wouldn't expect a scenario like this, right? But I think that these kind of scenarios are much more common than people recognize, and I think the one way to really get through that phobia is you're not going to hate your next door neighbor if you know them and then you find out their orientation is different, right? But we don't necessarily think that way. We see this as this huge issue that doesn't affect our daily lives, but there's loved ones in our daily lives that don't, you know, fit the norm that we expect them to, and Afghan standards or American standards, and we need to be aware of that.
Masujan?
Yeah, so I don't know, for anyone that is watching, Shoaib Webb brought up a point in his Periscope of can we be allies to different you know, communities that aren't necessarily within our own community. And thinking back to my own personal experiences growing up, you know, there was those friends who say, hey, don't use the word gay, or don't use this word, or really don't use that word. So it's a matter of time before it comes back to you. So September 11 happened, you know, the whole terrorist aspect came through. You know, everyone started calling you a terrorist because you're brown or you're Afghan, or not all of a sudden everyone knows who people are from Afghanistan are. So in a mindset, it's thinking about talking to people who are being not classified as human anymore. You know, you're calling them a certain thing, and so I feel like personally, if I saw somebody getting jumped, I would stand up for them, whether they're black, white, whatever they are, or if they're gay, if they're not gay, for instance. And the same aspect goes there. I mean, you can lie. You might not agree with their ways or what their lifestyle is, you know, but at the same time, as a person, as a human being, you want to stand up for that person. I think make sure that, you know, they're not being mistreated in that certain aspect. You don't have to agree with what they do, and I think within our community, I think that's, some people are like that. You know, they might not agree with the lifestyle or, you know, even the same-sex marriage for this purpose, but at the same time, you have that aspect of who you are as a person to want to stand up for somebody else in general too.
Ali John, and then we'll go to Bilal.
I 100% agree, and I think the tone and the message that's coming across from the panel is that personal quality that's absolutely necessary if we're going to tackle this problem. People don't hate persons, they hate people. They hate abstracts, they hate groups, and they fear that. But if we were to start talking about these in personal terms, what would you do if your family member, a sister, a brother, a cousin, a child was part of the LGBT community? How would we then react? Even you're not going to agree with your brother, you're not going to agree with your sister all the time. We disagree all the time. Me and Diz are cousins, we agree on nothing. But if Diz is being targeted and oppressed, I will be the first person to stand behind him. And that's how we need to think of this, in personal terms. These aren't people, these are persons, these are family members, these are cousins, these are members of our community.
Bilal?
Thank you for that really powerful point. I completely agree. I think we relate to individuals that we know. But one thing that I want to underscore, bring our attention to, is that we're talking about homosexuality as a lifestyle, or like it's a choice, right? But where the overwhelming lived experience of people in the queer community, the LGBTQ community, is that it's not a choice. People wouldn't sign up for this ostracization, for the eternal damnation, for the incredibly difficult life, if it were a choice, right? And so I understand that that's something that's not easy to think about, because, or it's not something that may not be intuitive, but the lived experience is that it's not a choice. So whether or not you believe that it's genetic or nature versus nurture, we have to be careful that when we use words like lifestyle, really what we're talking about is an identity, just like and something that we can't change. Just like you can't change that you were born Afghan. A gay person can't change that they were born gay.
Lema?
I'd like to also share a point of my personal stories with people who have come out to me as being gay. And none of them were celebrations. These individual people were crying and hurting because they didn't want to accept, they were hurt that they had to accept themselves as this way. And so I echo the sentiments of Bilal when we talk about this as a choice, because from my personal experiences, there are individuals who don't want to be different than society. They don't choose to want to be left out of a power structure. They want to be involved. And so, I think it's just a matter of engaging with these folks and people who go through these emotional issues, and the importance of having conversations are only going to take us to the next level of our understanding.
I wanted to also touch on a couple of things that Masood brought up, some good points that in his discussion. So one of the things he brought up was the use of the word gay, and I think we all have heard that, we've all seen that, and if someone could just kind of maybe touch a little bit on questions. And we talked about this when we had our discussion on the Baltimore uprisings. We talked about the language that we use around black people, and in our discussion around patriarchy and misogyny, we talked about our language around the oppression of women and the kind of language we use around that. So if someone could just kind of touch on how they're called microaggressions, how they can kind of contribute to a bigger problem, and how it might affect folks. Dojan?
So for me personally, I know growing up, I used to use the word all the time to describe it. I would use that. I would use the F word, and for me, what it took honestly was I had a coworker who was gay, and he was the first person I really connected with that was gay, and I've never had a friend openly come out to me, and he was already out before I met him. But I remember being with a group of friends and someone using that word, and it kind of made me think, what if someone used this word to my friend? I think I'd want to punch him in the face. So it's after thinking about it that way, I told myself that I would never use that word to describe something or use that word as an insult, because we don't know the effect of our words. But just as bad as it is to call someone who's African American the N-word, using the F word towards someone who's a homosexual or describing something as being gay for when it's just degrading to them. You gotta watch what you say, because your words do affect people, especially with a community that has a higher suicide rate, a higher depression rate. We need to watch what we say, and we can't use words that are gonna bring other people down. Just like we don't want other people to bring us down, we shouldn't use words that are gonna bring other people down.
Alijan?
Yeah, absolutely right. And I think what it comes to, the center of this all, is language of that type is dehumanizing. It strips a person of their humanity, and it intersects explicitly and intimately with racism and misogyny. These are all ways of stripping a person of their humanity based off of your prejudice, based off of your fear. And like misogyny, like racism, homophobia can only be tackled by starting first and foremost with ourselves, the language that we use when we describe our fellow human beings, right? Do we reduce them, right? Do we strip them of their humanity? Then how do we treat them as individuals, as people, Are they our fellow brothers, or do we treat them as a second-class citizen? Are they other and different from us and therefore not worthy of the same dignity? These are the type of questions we need to ask ourselves of every time we come to the language that we use and the actions that we take, and then we spread that throughout our community. We talk to our friends about it, we talk to our family members about it, and we make sure that we hold each other accountable and our community accountable to treat everyone with dignity.
I wanted to read some statistics. There was a report from the president that came out on bullying on LGBT youth. So some of the numbers, and then we'll touch a little bit on religion, a little just for a bit after that. But some of the numbers that came out, it said that out of the LGBT youth, 84% said in the nation said they were verbally abused. 40% say that they were physically assaulted. 91% of LGBT middle or high school students said they heard the word faggot, dyke, or queer said to them either sometimes or frequently. That's 91%. 63% said that was actually from staff and faculty that worked at these schools. 45% attempted suicide, as compared to 8% of heterosexual youth. So that's 45% versus 8% of heterosexual youth. So 45% of LGBT youth attempt suicide. And 30% of 7th graders said they wouldn't stay friends with somebody who was gay, and 44% said they would prefer to attend a school that did not have any gay people. So these are the numbers. These are the reasons why I think we want to highlight and talk about these things. And because the language that we use, the way we talk about these things, the jokes we make, all contribute to the cycle, all contribute to violence. So we say words don't matter, but they contribute to this violence. And I think that that's a really important thing to think about when we're doing that. So I wanted to touch a little bit on religion. This isn't necessarily, we talked about being a debate between whether or not this is acceptable in religion, but I would like to know from some folks about how religion has maybe contributed to some of this homophobia. And also I want to know, how has religion contributed to, has or is contributing to ending some of this homophobia and removing some of it? And are they mutually exclusive, and how can we use them within our community? So if folks want to jump in on that, I'll take whoever gets off their mic first. Anyone want to volunteer? Ali John?
I'll bite the bullet. I don't want to dominate the conversation, so I was very careful about that. But this is an interesting question. It's also a very difficult question to answer, and that is because it's a topic that is vast. And it comes down to matters of interpretation and historicity. And I could sit here and spend hours upon hours discussing the role of homosexuality and same-sex relationship within the history of Islam. It is, in fact, one of my specialties. But it will not convince everyone. And that's the reality of belief and the reality of faith, is that it's always going to be subjective. But what is not up for debate is the equality of human dignity. And I think that's what the conversation really needs to be about. I can't convince people on the finer points of Islamic theology and Islamic law. At the end of the day, I have found that most people will seek out information that confirms things that they've already come to believe anyways. But what we can do is talk about how religion encourages us to be compassionate, to be for equality, to fight for justice for everybody, even if we do not agree or understand. There is an injunction within Islam and within most religions that we need to fight for human compassion. How people interpret the different verses of the Quran, the different hadiths, is complicated, and it's going to be different. The only thing that I can say is that religion is meant to be a guide by which you live your life. When you start to use it as a weapon to bludgeon other people with, you've transformed religion into a tool of oppression.
And Bilal, go ahead.
That's once again a really powerful point, and if you hadn't said it, I think I would have said it as well. So thank you for that. Growing up, I wanted to be who Reza Aslan is now, right? I wanted to be this learned Muslim scholar and find a path of like an interpretation that would validate me, that would validate me and my identity and make me and kind of tell me that I am okay, that I'm not going to hell, that I was born like this and I'm not going to hell for the way I was born. And so I think it's very easy to think that religion and homophobia go hand in hand, but in my experience, it's been more nuanced. I've found a lot of grace through Islam and in this state. I think, like Ali said, Islam teaches us to be compassionate to each other, and teaches us to remember that we aren't the judge of anyone else, only God is, right? And I also look at the example of the Prophet, peace be upon him, how he treated the most marginalized people in his community, people who threw garbage at him daily, he treated with compassion and grace. But when we go to a mosque today, we don't treat people of the LGBTQ community like that. We say astaghfirullah and keep that away from me and all this, and it's like, well, okay, you believe that homosexual act is a sin, but we're not talking about the act. We're talking about people, and so there's this incredible potential for grace and fulfillment through religion that I think is overlooked.
Nurajan?
And sort of echoing off of what Bilal Jan and Ali Jan said, I think for me what's been disappointing and sort of what has happened in terms of after the decision of the Supreme Court is it's Ramadan and people who are supposedly observant by sort of whatever metrics we use, the language they were using to sort of vent their frustrations. I was like, for me, fundamentally, one of the biggest learning lessons I remember a scholar saying is that there's almost nothing as worse as hurting someone's feelings. And I'm not saying it articulately, but in terms of the compassion we need to have, the consideration we need to have for other people, it is serious, and we don't take it seriously enough in terms of how we articulate our views. And when we say something, I don't think we realize the power of our words in terms of how it can hurt others. And we've been talking about these suicide and depression rates and things, and it really is these words that we just sort of like carelessly throw out, not realizing the depth of impact it has on people's lives. When we engage in these discourses, we think of this as this intellectual debate, but people are living through daily challenges because their feelings are, their existence is being invalidated by the kinds of conversations we're having. And I think we really need to recognize just how harmful our words are. And for me, religion is a source of love. And once we move away from that becoming a source of love into being this tool to invalidate how others feel, that's when we really get into a dangerous space.
And I know, for me, I think that what's been refreshing to see is that I think more, Muslim scholars and imams, and I think one thing there's a misconception that this topic or this issue has never been discussed, or this issue doesn't have any sort of like research or knowledge base behind it, but it definitely exists if you search it out. One of the things that I've seen is that though I may not agree with everything that's being said by some of the religious figures that are coming out, Muslim religious figures, I think that it's been really great to see that they're tackling it and that they're talking about it and that it's something that's being brought up, and that acknowledgement that being gay is not a choice is something that I personally never thought that I would see growing up. I had assumed that Islam and religious figures would have one set of opinions, and there are some that do believe that, but it's nice to see that narrative is being challenged and that there are folks coming out with something. And then that doesn't necessarily mean that I agree with everything they say or disagree with everything they say, but the fact that the conversation is happening within the Muslim community is really good. And I think, like Masood touched on Sahib Webb's discussion on YouTube or on Periscope the other day that talked about it, and some other folks that have been contributing to it. So Ali Jan, I'll let you touch on this, and then we'll actually move on to the actual ruling afterwards.
Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right. One of the things that we have to recognize is there can be a tendency towards certainty when it comes to religion. We're so assured that we know the right interpretation. right? And everyone else is wrong. I'll relate a funny little anecdote, if I may, about a guy who converted to Christianity. This is an apocryphal story. Guy converted to Christianity, and he attended church for the first time, and he was met by one of the elders, and he's like, "Oh, I'm so glad you converted to Christianity. You know, we're the one true religion. Everyone else is going to hell." And the guy was like, "Well, thank God I converted." He's like, "But to be honest with you, it's not all Christians. It happens to be this church. Everyone in this church is going to heaven, and all other Christians and other religions are going to hell." And he's like, "Well, it's a good thing I joined this church." And he goes, "You know, to be honest with you, it's really just me and the pastor, and I'm not too sure about the pastor." And that's really what comes down to this type of arrogance and dogmatism that comes into religion. There is a long history and debate about same-sex relationships within Islam, and it is not, and I'm going to get a lot of flack for saying this, but I'm always happy to put myself on the line, it is not a settled matter, and it certainly isn't. Anyone who says it's prohibited has not understood its history yet. Okay, there's a lot more going on there, and you're welcome to have different opinions, but you need to, it takes a level of courage to challenge your own prejudices, your own ideas, your preconceived notions, and to look at the history and the diversity of opinion that is within Islam and encourage that type of discussion. The only thing I can say about the intersection of religion and the LGBTQ community, for me, and to kind of sum up my views, is that a religious community, nor for that matter any community, will not be remembered by how holy they claim to be, but how they treat the most vulnerable within that community. And there is no group more vulnerable within the Islamic community, within the Muslim community, within the American community, like the LGBT community. And how we treat them is how we will be remembered.
Thank you, Ali John. And I think we'll kind of shift over to the actual ruling in the Supreme Court case and maybe talk a little bit about that. So I know Nasrallah Johns commented on Facebook, and I think this was the question we were going to talk about as well, was just kind of like, as Afghan Americans in general, why are we against the Supreme Court opinion when we're a minority community? Just a week before, my Facebook wall was filled with comments regarding the case of Abercrombie & Fitch and the Muslim women who faced discrimination for covering. And so basically kind of touching on how can we as a minority community talk about this issue or be against kind of same-sex marriage, and how does that play a part in our understanding of it and what that ruling is going to mean for us? So a couple of things I kind of threw in all at once for y'all. So just if anyone wants to touch on that a little bit. So John?
I don't think we can, as a minority community, be against the rights for another minority community. Because just like we discussed in the Ferguson case, if we don't step up for a minority community that has more of a majority than we do, who's going to step up for us? Being Afghan Americans, we don't have a huge population compared to the LGBTQ community here or to another minority community. And if we're not stepping up for other minorities' rights being taken away, who's going to step up for ours? We need to stand together and be allies with these communities so we can fight against injustices that are happening not only to their community but to our community as well. So instead of being an enemy to this community, we need to be an ally to this community.
And Bilal, go ahead.
I just want to be clear that so with the Supreme Court decision, of course progress is progress, but to be quite honest, I think the right to marriage is a very privileged right? And so for the vast majority of people who will be enfranchised by this are already doing okay. The people who don't have civil liberties and civil rights respected in the LGBTQ community are people of color, are poor people, are people who have other problems, maybe addictions and things like that. And so those struggles are much more at the forefront of the larger struggle than whether or not down the line someone who is settled and has a job and just doesn't have the tax benefits of marriage. I think it's kind of very it's interesting that this debate about queer rights, about the queer movement, about the LGBTQ community and inclusion and compassion towards them has all become centralized on this debate about whether or not they can get married, when in reality people can get fired. People they have people don't have housing protections. They can get fired. They can get beat up on the street and it not be called a hate crime. And so we're here applauding ourselves from passing this very like I said, it's progress is progress, but it almost seems like we started building the house with the roof first instead of the foundation.
Samira, John, go ahead.
Yeah, to build up on that, us in Canada, we've had gay marriage legalized for, I think it's been over 10 years now. And if you speak to the LGBTQ people of color community here, they constantly bring up this issue that it's not, legalizing marriage hasn't made their struggles any easier. They are still facing more violence, more stigma, more discrimination than they have ever faced because of this intersection of Islamophobia and racism that's on the rise. The legalization of marriage hasn't really made their lives any easier. So just thought I'd toss that in because we've had it legalized for quite a bit here, and realistically it's only made a difference for the white men in Canada, if you think about it, those who have the financial capital to get married, those who benefit from the institution of marriage. People of color haven't reaped those benefits at all if you really look into it.
And there's also this this notion that now that this is legalized, that number one, I think Samir and Bilal touched on it, that now there's no other rights that need to be fought for. And I think Bilal and Samira John just kind of articulated that there still is a struggle. There still are many problems that exist. And then there's also this notion that now all of a sudden everything has kind of changed, and suddenly that the world has kind of flipped upside down. And I think an important thing for people to know is that I think in like 37 states it was already legal. It's only 13 new states that now have the rights or can have to sanction same-sex marriages. So our world has not really flipped upside down. There's really more or less a paper attached to what has already been happening, and I guess the notion, and I mean, a lot of people have the question though about the books that our children read, or that in the media, those kinds of things. I mean, that's something that a lot of people are raising and are asking about though. So I don't know if anyone else has an answer to that, or kind of wanted to touch on that as to what that might mean or what that might look like. I'll go to Arzo John and then Nora John after.
I think Afghans, like the Afghan community, that reacted so negatively to the ruling, they see it as, wow, this is such a big victory for the LGBT community, that the government's forcing it upon us now, and now this is going to promote more homosexuality, and it's like a plague amongst us. That's how they treat it, and yet, like Bilal John and Samira John explained, it's such a small victory. They are still going to be marginalized, and there are businesses that still have the right to deny services to anybody in business that don't have to hire them, and they still face all these unfair these just unfair practices. It's quite unfortunate. They, like Bilal stated, they can still be attacked and assaulted on the streets and not be titled as or labeled as a hate crime. And we don't understand. In fact, they are probably far more vulnerable now because of this ruling than any other time. People see it as a threat, and it's not. It's a very small victory, and I think that we're a very long way from changing societal responses and so many of the other aspects of marginalization that they face every day.
We're gonna go to Nura John, and then we'll shift over to talking, and we'll kind of end a little bit on talking about how do we deal with this within our families, within our own communities that we might have. So go ahead, Nura John.
I guess the only point, I completely agree with what was said in terms of people who are marginalized are sort of left out of this. This affects a certain group of people. The only point I was going to underscore is that the power of documentation, right, in terms of marriage being legal, is that my colleague, his partner is not a U.S. citizen, so he was on the brink of being deported until this law passed and became legal, right? So when you come to undocumented peoples, right, and sort of their safety, this does affect them, and this might indeed be a way for people who are the most marginalized to have a tiny step forward if it's used. And so the documentation in terms of being accepted by the legal system is powerful, and I think we can't undercut sort of like the meaning of that, because it does change some people's lives. But in terms of this going far enough, it definitely helps and assists the most privileged the most. And but I do think that there is a power to what passed that we have to acknowledge too, particularly for undocumented people.
Bilal, I think you wanted to say something.
No, I think that's a really powerful point. I completely agree. I didn't mean to undermine the power of this decision, and so I thank Nourajan for saying that. I think when you and I, Ahmad, were talking about this earlier, one way that I understood it is just like racism wasn't over when we elected President Obama, homophobia is not going to be over now that this decision has been passed. And so you know, we can see with Ferguson and everything there, it's in a lot of ways it's come more to a head, and so I think we should prepare ourselves for that.
And can I add something really tiny? I wondered what John and what others thought about the commercialization of this, the fact that like Facebook had this filter and like all these corporations have this flag. I didn't know how to feel about it, and I just wanted to kick that out there as a follow-up.
Did anyone want to jump in on that first, or Bilal, go ahead.
I apologize if I'm speaking too much, but I think this is I think it's a really good question, and I think something that I experienced personally. Like, I think the corporatization, commercialization is, in my opinion, disgusting. I think you know, we're talking about civil rights. We're not talking about a way for a corporation to promote itself. Or I think even these organizations like Human Rights Campaign, they do good work, but the fact that their entire purpose for existence is to pursue this one issue is very narrow-minded. And so, like, you know, you have companies like Northrop Grumman who say, oh, we're out for gay rights. Northrop Grumman makes the drones that kill people in Afghanistan and Iraq and Yemen. So it's like, how can you, why do you think that we're going to be your, you know, cheering for you, you know, when you're taking this very disgusting stance of supporting one group's rights, but you know, killing people literally with the other hand.
So Ariana, John actually just posted on Facebook about, and was talking a little bit about, you know, Afghans in Afghanistan and kind of some of what they go through, and also mentioned the idea of bachabazi, which is something that I think is mentioned a lot when this discussion happens with within the Afghan community, and that comparison, or that that relationship, and how they might be kind of conflated, how the two might be conflated. We are running short on time. It's about to be iftar soon for folks on the West Coast, so we're going to have to wrap things up. So if one or two people want to quickly touch on the notion of bachabazi and how that's being used, and how that might be different, or what you want to kind of touch on in terms of that. So John, go ahead.
I think that's the problem, is a lot of people are equating homosexuality to pedophilia, as Bilal mentioned earlier. And I think that's what scares people, like, you know, for lack of a better word, or gives them an ignorance on you know, homosexuality, because they see it in Afghanistan as pedophilia. They don't see it as like love between one person and another person. They're looking at it from an idea of pedophilia, and I can understand that, like, that could be a scary notion, but pedophilia and homosexuality aren't the same. You know, like, they're completely different. And this notion of tying it together and making it seem like they are, or even similar, is disgusting. And we need to get out of that mindset, because if we don't, we'll never progress, and we'll never learn to accept homosexuality in our community if we keep comparing it to things like bachabazi or pedophilia. And it's disgusting that we have to even, like, tell people that they shouldn't equate it to that.
And now I wanted to add on to that one thing that for people to understand what pedophilia, sexual assault, bashawazi, they're all kind of in the same, and it's a notion of power, and it's an exercise in power, and then there's a power dynamic that exists in those types of things. When it is something like pedophilia or sexual assault, whatever it may be, someone is being taken advantage of in these situations, and when we and one of the things that we need to understand is that we have consent versus people who are being forced into these things, which is what is happening for a lot of folks. And I think that's one thing people need to understand. Jon Stewart, he was on the Daily Show when he was talking about this, was talking about like polygamy. He was like, now that people are saying, we need to, legalize polygamy, and people need to marry. He said people are not born polygamists. People are born with these ideas, with being gay or not, and so polygamy is not something you're born into. And I think that that's also something to another point that a lot of people bring up as well that I wanted to touch on. So we're gonna wrap things up. So the last thing that I wanted people to just maybe to touch on, any final comments, any final words that people may have to kind of end us tonight. I think that would be good. So so I wanted to give some folks the opportunity to do that. We'll take about a couple more minutes to try to wrap things up here. I saw Bilal unmuted himself, so if he wants to go first, but just unmute yourself whenever you want to chime in.
I just want to thank everyone. Growing up, I never thought that this conversation would be possible. I thought I would be dead before I would be able to talk in a sympathetic, compassionate way, understanding way with other Afghans, other Muslims. And so this is really powerful, really incredibly touching for any other, for the lack of a better word. And so I want to thank you, all of you.
And I think we all owe Bilal some thanks for joining us, and everyone else, all the other panelists here who have joined. I know it's not an easy subject to talk about, so a lot of bravery and a lot of courage for folks that are on this thing. So Samira, John, I'll let you go, and then Lema.
Yeah, I think working with LGBTQ Afghan youth here in Toronto, I think the biggest thing we need to take away from this is providing those sort of support networks. I mean, this conversation has been great, but how do we translate this back into our immediate local communities? Muslim LGBTQ youth have, avenues to go through. There are organizations, there are community groups that they can turn to in trying to cope with the struggles that they face. But that doesn't exist amongst Afghans. And I think that's the biggest challenge for LGBTQ Afghans, is the fact that you have to pick between either your community, your gay community, or your Muslim community, or your Afghan community, and that shouldn't have to happen. And I think what we need to do is continue these conversations and provide that support to those in our communities.
Lema, John, go ahead. I caught you.
That was actually an accident, but I really enjoyed being a part of this panel, and I know that we may or may not represent what everyone else thinks, and so I appreciate this candid discussion, the openness for people watching that have different viewpoints, and I just want to challenge everyone to continue challenging their own preconceived notions about this issue.
Arza, John?
So I guess this is more for any Afghans that are internally struggling with this very issue, and I want to let you guys know that I accept you, and my heart is with you guys, and I want you to feel like you have somebody to talk to. And so if there's anybody out there that ever needs anybody to talk to, I want you to feel free to, send me a message, or I'll give you my number, and I'll spend as much time as you want to talk, to just listen and hear you out, because that's what we need to do for our community, whatever it is, whether, whatever it is, we all need somebody. And so I think that, like John said earlier, religion is to spread love, and so I want to give you my love and my acceptance. So.
Ali John.
I wanted to thank everyone here and Bilal John as well for joining us. I'm deeply moved by the courage of everyone on this panel and the compassion that they've showed. And it's amazing that we can have these discussions. A lot of powerful things were said here, a lot of important things were said here, and I hope that it makes an impact. The one question, kind of rhetorical question that I want to leave for me is, what type of society do we want to leave for our children? Do we want to leave a society where people are terrified of being themselves, where people are oppressed and assaulted and attacked and have their rights taken away? No matter what your beliefs are, is that the society that you want to leave behind, where people are afraid to approach their mother and father or siblings or members of their community and say, I am gay or I am whatever? Or do you want to leave behind a society that accepts people, that loves them for who they are, where people feel comfortable and people feel safe with who they are? It's a rhetorical question. I don't know if it's a fair question, but I think it's an important question.
Thank you. I mean, some of the stuff that's been said has been absolutely amazing, and I think it's been a privilege to be a part of this panel, and I hope that everyone has really taken some lessons and some things away from this. And, you know, Arzu John, you know, for offering, you know, I echo that sentiment, and I think a lot of people, I think most people on this, everyone on this panel would be, you know, okay, just, you know, if you need someone to talk to, reach out to, feel free to reach out to any one of us, because it takes a lot of courage and a lot of bravery to talk about this and to come out. And I think, and I also want to acknowledge, you know, people who may, you know, be receiving this information, how important it is to be supportive and to show compassion, to show mercy, and to really, you know, it might be a difficult thing to struggle with at first, but, you know, it's something that we, it's important to be supportive, and it's really important to show that and to not be judgmental, and let that person make the decisions for themselves, and let that person decide what's right for them, and not, you know, be the one that's kind of telling them what to do. Because I think one thing we should note is that, you know, people who are struggling with this know what the reality is of the situation. So please, we encourage all of you to keep the discussions going. This is only the beginning. This is only the start of the conversation. This is not meant to be the end. This is only meant to spark something for all of you, whether that's in your homes, in your communities, whatever that may be, wherever that may be, whatever that might look like. Encourage all of you to please continue on these conversations. Really, really want to thank every single person on this panel. You all did absolutely amazing, and the people that have been behind the scenes to kind of put this on and to help this, who weren't on here today as well, to get this going. So I'm extremely proud as an Afghan, as a Muslim, that we were able to have this conversation, and especially during Ramadan. So thank you all for joining us. Hopefully you got something out of it, and salam.